Hi, I'm Malika Bilal in for Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, as Apple and the FBI continue their legal face-off, we look into what the dispute means for both sides. Our digital producer, Omar Madar, is here to help me break down what's been happening on and offline.
That's right, Malika. And as you and many of our viewers already know, Apple's rejection of last week's court order to help the FBI get into the iPhone of one of the San Bernardino shooters did exactly what Apple CEO Tim Cook called for. It started a conversation, and as you can see here, it's actually a growing one. The company is being asked to create software to bypass the iPhone's security encryption feature without erasing any of the data on the phone. Seems simple enough, but of course the question is about implications. How would that actually work?
That is the question. Many fear if Apple loses this battle, it could open the door to more high-tech surveillance, and it could force companies to become pawns for the government and for law enforcement.
Something, of course, the FBI is dismissing completely and insisting that Apple's compliance would only be used to help with this particular investigation into December's mass shooting and getting justice for the victims.
And in the midst of this legal battle, both sides are also vying to win in the court of public opinion.
And you can already see it in the language being used to talk about this, with it being framed as national security versus privacy. But we want to know where you stand on this issue, so be sure to tweet us using the hashtag AJStream.
I'm looking forward to your tweets. There's so many angles to this story. So to help us look into the concerns from all sides, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by Julian Sanchez, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute who studies the intersection of technology, privacy, and civil liberties. Eric Geller is an editor and political reporter at the Daily.online newspaper. And Susan Hennessey, a national security law fellow at the Brookings Institution. Welcome, everyone, to the stream. Now, Eric, I want to get started with you. Why is this more complicated than just give the FBI the passcode to this one phone?
Well, the FBI says that it's interested in accessing this phone. They have a terrorism investigation here, and FBI Director James Comey just today said this isn't about setting a precedent. This is about this particular investigation. Of course, Apple's response to that, privacy advocates' response to that, kind of tells you why this is a much bigger deal, which is if Apple loses in this case, and the case here involves a very old law, an interpretation of that law that could require Apple to help the FBI in future cases, Apple says if we lose here, this could be a slippery slope to more intrusive searches by the government into other phones in different circumstances. And of course, this is all coming in the context of a bigger debate about encryption and should tech companies write their encryption in a particular way so that they can always bypass it if the government says, we've got a warrant, we need to see this data. That's kind of the broader picture. But what Apple is saying is, hey, if we comply here, or if we lose this battle, we're going to see court orders coming in under the same legal framework that are more intrusive and that get closer to something that we are not comfortable with and that our customers are not comfortable with. And you had Apple CEO Tim Cook just recently saying he thinks this would set a very dangerous precedent. So that's the bigger context, and that's why it's sort of not just about this one case.
Right. So, Julian, you heard Eric there mention the word encryption. Tell us, in this case, what this actually means, because actually isn't the first layer of this about entering a passcode the correct way so that the FBI can get into the phone?
That's right. Starting in the, I think it was iOS 8 update, what Apple did was set it so that by default, all the data on an iPhone is encrypted with a key that's stored on the phone itself and is very hard to extract. It's physically burned into a chip. And that key is combined with the user's own passcode to create a kind of entangled key. So the user's own passcode is part of the key to the encryption. And Apple has also designed the phone so that you can't just copy the data off and try to attack it with very fast computers on, somewhere in NSA headquarters. You actually have to run it through the phone. And if you guess wrong 10 times, the keys are wiped and it becomes sort of permanently inaccessible. And there's also an escalating delay the more wrong guesses you make. So what they really want Apple to do here is not hand over a key they already have. Under sort of existing law, it's reasonably clear that if they knew a passcode and could enter it and unlock the phone, they would probably have to hand over that information. What they're saying to Apple is, we want you to build us a hacking tool and sign it with your Apple developer key so that it will look like an authentic update that the phone recognizes and runs like official Apple software, and then help us use that hacking tool to take an unlimited number of guesses at what the passcode is. Now, if it were a long and complicated passcode, that would still be no good. It would still not get you at the data on the phone in less than a few hundred years.
But if it's 1, 2, 3, 4.
But if it's a 4-digit code or maybe even a 6-digit code, you can do it in a few hours or maybe a few days.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions being raised is how much people actually understand this technical aspect, because Pew put out a poll here that you can see on my screen suggesting that 51% of people actually support the FBI's position in this, saying that Apple should basically turn over the phone and open it up for them to access it. But people are suggesting that's because when you frame it as should they unlock the terror suspect's iPhone, surely everybody would agree.
Right.
Do you think, Susan, that had people understood that this could actually apply to other phones, do you think public opinion would still be leaning in that direction?
So I think this is false. I think that, being presented with the notion that public opinion is against them, sort of advocates of Apple's position take the position, well, the issue here is that really you don't understand the technology. If you knew what we knew, you would agree with us. I think that's probably not the case, right? I think people are able to understand the difference between the kinds of concerns that are raised by compromising the integrity of cryptographic codes versus what the FBI is asking here. Some people have sort of tried to frame this as the difference between a front door and a back door. These are enormously complex technical issues, but it's important to understand that they're specific to this operating system.
Although, I believe Reuters actually did another poll that came out just today where they explained a little bit more and they got a different result. They did find much more support for Apple when Apple's argument is explained a little more fully and it's not just presented as they could unlock this phone should they.
Right, so
and it's actually, just before you jump in there, I just want to show that because he mentioned it. I have it here on my laptop. This was the wording. It was a little bit different. It said, agree or disagree with Apple's decision to oppose a court order to unlock a smartphone that was used by one of the shooters in the San Bernardino attack. Kind of a mouthful there, but the results were a little bit different.
Right, so look, the results are different. I would also answer yes to that question. If an American company believes that a lawful order is defective somehow, yeah, they should challenge that order in court. A federal judge determines whether or not the law appropriately applies. So I think really the questions are getting at different values. Look, I think both polls demonstrate essentially that there's divided opinion here, right? What difference does it make if it's 49% or 50 or 51%, right? These are incredibly complex decisions, but it's not reasonable for Silicon Valley to sort of dismiss the opinions of at least half the country or close to it based on, well, you guys just don't understand how math works.
So,
well, I do think that there is a precedent issue here that does require you to understand technology and to understand the idea of legal precedent. I mean, if we've seen anything over the course of the last decade and a half, especially with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which approves a lot of these wiretaps, it is that once you get a judge to accept a novel interpretation of the law, it's a lot easier to get another judge to do the same thing because you've already built a case and you've had that issue resolved by a member of the judicial branch. So what Apple would say here is it's not so much that this case is very nuanced, it's that if we do this, we're getting into a situation where other judges might approve an order that's a little bit more controversial just because somebody else has previously approved one. And I think that does require you to understand the legal system in a way that I'm not necessarily sure everyone in that Pew poll understood.
I'm also seeing a lot of folks just on social media who seem to think that Apple has a kind of magic unlock button they can hit, and they're just refusing to do it even though they already have it, which is fundamentally not the situation here.
Although notably, it is exactly the situation in a different case in the Eastern District of New York, in which Apple does have the key to unlock a phone, in that case of a methamphetamine dealer, not a terrorist, and they're refusing to do so based on essentially an assertion of reputational harm, right? They're worried that it's going to hurt their street cred to provide assistance that they've provided to the government approximately 70 times in the past.
So it's, maybe they should lose that case and win this one. I haven't looked as closely at the facts there.
But there's one of the other concerns that's coming up a lot online. We have Amy who tweeted in saying, I back Apple. What concerns me is that all hackers out there in the world, if you write a program like this, we will all be doomed. And you have Daniel over here also adding to this saying, exceptional access keys become the ultimate target for hackers. Do you share that concern? Do you think that,
I think that is, if you look at Tim Cook's open letter, that is exactly his concern. It's not, we don't feel like unlocking one phone one time. It's, we are worried that if you make us create Apple-signed code that is a hacking tool, one, anytime we do that, there's a risk of that code getting out. It's going to be another thing we have to keep secure that can be potentially turned into a skeleton key if our attempts to link it to one device are not perfect. But also that it's not just this hacking tool, it's all sorts of hacking tools. The next agency might say not, we want you to unlock the phone we already have, but we want to turn on the microphone on the Mac laptop. And in principle, they can do that too if they disguise something as an official update that's pushed out. They see that this opens the door to a systemic flood of requests for them to create code that, if it ever escaped, would be dangerous.
So there's been a lot of talk about opening doors here. And Eric, earlier we heard Susan talk about a backdoor. So I want to show you something on my laptop. This is a cartoon that's going around by a cartoonist's name is Carlson, and he calls it Pandora's iPhone. You can see here's the back door on an iPhone. There is Tim Cook. Behind him is the FBI. Behind him is hackers, progressive regimes, regressive regimes, etc. So talk of these hackers and everyone having this key. But talk to us, for your average person, your lay person, what is a backdoor? What does that even mean?
So a backdoor is essentially an element of code that is designed to circumvent some security measure. So this is where we get into the legal context of the larger debate. This is not as much about this particular order. This is about where this order could lead. And there's a huge debate in Washington right now about this. So what some senior intelligence officials, such as the FBI director, want to do is go to Apple, go to Google, go to anybody who designs encryption and say, you need to design encryption that is strong, but that has a hole right here where we can get you to go through it and access encrypted data if we bring you a warrant. So backdoor, I mean, we've definitely heard Jim Comey say, the FBI director say, I don't want a backdoor, I want a front door. The thing is, any kind of door where the company that designs the encryption can bypass their own encryption is a vulnerability. It is a way to get past a form of security. And if I can just sort of illustrate this for a minute, there's a company called Juniper Networks that makes a device that companies put in their offices that separates their network from the internet. It's called a firewall. And last year, they announced that there was some suspicious code in this device, and it looks very much like a piece of code that the NSA engineered to have a backdoor, so that if the NSA knew that that was in a product, they could go through it. And there's a big debate right now. There's a congressional inquiry into whether any federal agencies are using this piece of hardware. If so, and a hacker knew that that backdoor was there, they could potentially get through that. And so that illustrates what the stakes are if you take this legal argument forward. As Julian was saying, this isn't just going to be about turning off security measures on an older phone so the FBI can break through it. If you think about how the law can be used in the future, we could get to a point where they're pushing software updates to your iPhone that puts a backdoor in there. And again, no one has said that they want to do that now, but I think if you look at how the law has been used in the past and you look at what that vulnerability is, that kind of gives you a sense of what a problem would be if your iPhone or your Android phone had encryption that was deliberately compromised.
That raises the question, sort of the moral and legal question about the relationship between government and company. So we have Charlie over here who says, the Fourth Amendment guarantees the right to be secure in persons, houses, papers, and effects. Smartphones are effectively effects and papers. And we have Lovecanal here, great Twitter name handle, says this is the case that defines the freedoms that the founders intended for the U.S. No business should be compelled to work for the government. Susan, what do you make of these thoughts?
Right, but so just as the FBI may be sort of understating the value of precedent here, the advocates behind Apple are clearly overstating it, right? This court case is about this court case. It's about whether or not Apple has to provide this particular assistance. Now, sure, there will be precedential value from that decision. However, this decision cannot possibly be used to tell Apple to create new types of backdoors in the future. That's not how the legal process works. And as to the question about the Fourth Amendment, I think it's really important that we understand that what the question here is about a lawful court order, right? A federal judge has determined that there's probable cause. In this case, probable cause to unlock the phone of somebody who murdered 14 people and shot 22 others. So while I think it really raises the important question that we all have to think about here, and that is, do we want the scope of lawful access? Do we want the scope of our constitutional rights to be determined by technology, or do we want them to be determined by the law? And as technology moves and potentially moves ahead of the law, how do we strike that balance? I think it really resolves to a question of who decides here. Traditionally, we understand that the people decide. You know, we vote, we put representatives in Congress, they're supposed to pass laws, sometimes they do that. I think we can all agree that it's probably not Tim Cook's job to decide.
So you mentioned him. So Julian, I actually want to show you a page I pulled up on my screen. This is an ABC News exclusive. He did an interview this week with ABC News, and he said the iPhone cracking software is the equivalent of cancer. Basically, this is, you know, big words, strong words here. I'm wondering your thoughts on this, and does this mean that the Apple team would have to create a whole new iOS, a new operating system for this phone, and that could potentially be used for other phones? And
wow, they don't have to create the whole operating system. They just really need the boot ROM basically that starts it up. They don't need to, you know, write a new set of phone apps or anything like that. But I think, you know, the analogy works in the sense that what I think he's saying here is this is something that risks spreading out of control. Companies like this spend enormous effort and put a lot of thought into creating secure environments for those developer keys that are used to sign and authenticate software that's going to look like a real update. It's going to be a lot harder for them if they're predictably going to be asked tomorrow. Cyrus Vance, the Attorney General and the District Attorney in Manhattan, has said we've got 175 phones, and if Apple loses here, you know, the next day we expect them to be helping us open those phones. Police departments around the country. Once that flood of requests comes in, and they're saying you're going to have to develop this hacking code to attack the passcodes on hundreds of phones a year, if not thousands, the question is, can you be as confident that you can keep that code that you're using and deploying constantly as secure when you consider, you know, you have not just ordinary hackers, but huge criminal enterprises, China, Russian intelligence. There's lots of state-level actors that would love to get their hands on something like this. And the question is, what kind of additional challenge is it for them to keep that from getting out, from spreading out of control?
Right. So as you're saying that, Susan is looking like she wants to jump in. Eric was also nodding his head, but I want to know what the community is saying, Omar. What are they telling you?
On a fundamental level, I think there's a lot of sympathy to the idea that there should be a terrorism exception to basically privacy in this case. We have Shitu Yusuf over here who says, I do respect Apple's principles, but they should not be too rigid when it comes to a case of terrorism like this. They should have allowed the FBI to get into the phone. But you have the Eva over here says, anybody can be labeled a terrorist as per certain regime's interests. It can range from Snowden to an opposition leader. Eric, let me toss this to you. Do you think that this case maybe became such a big case because it seems that like the kind of case where everybody's going to have pretty strong sympathies because it's a pretty black and white situation, that maybe in other situations there would be a lot less sympathy to a request to get into somebody's phone just by throwing around a label like terrorist?
Absolutely. This is, you know, FBI Director James Comey has said that they did not pick this particular case to make a giant stand on. They are prosecuting various cases where they want Apple to open phones. But the fact that this is such an emotional issue, that the privacy aspect of the individual who controlled the phone, didn't own the phone, but controlled the phone, the fact that that person is a terrorist, a suspect in a mass shooting, and the fact that the owner, which is the county health department, had consented to, you know, to the search of the phone. Again, we have this Fourth Amendment question. A lot of that isn't an issue. The Fourth Amendment is not an issue here because the owner of the phone consented. And so you've got essentially the perfect situation for the FBI. Very sympathetic, no Fourth Amendment issues. Very difficult for Apple essentially to stand up and say, we don't want to do this. It's very easy to paint that, as many people have, as essentially opposing a terrorism investigation.
And I think, you know, that's exactly right. This is not a Fourth Amendment case. But it's also, I think, a little disingenuous of them to say we're not trying to make any kind of statement. Apple asked for this this request to be filed under seal. There's a dozen other lawsuits, most of which are under seal for other phones. They chose, against Apple's request, to file this one publicly. And this is after this summer, Bob Litt at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, he's sort of the spy community's general counsel, said, well, it looks like we've lost this fight for encryption backdoors basically for now, but if there's ever an attack, that'll be a chance to reopen this issue and maybe get the public on our side. you know, it looks an awful lot like they are following that playbook and have found an ideal case to have a public fight over.
Right, so one, I don't think that's an accurate representation of what Bob Litt was saying. He was saying that based on the reaction of the American people, legislation is not appropriate. It's not appropriate for the administration to pursue it at this time. That certainly was correct. Now, I'm not, certainly there shouldn't be special rules for, special constitutional protections for ordinary crimes and other constitutional protections for terrorism crimes. But sort of the intimation here is somehow that, that Jim Comey doesn't really care about this case, right? He's just using it. That's false, right? So he testified in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee just 2 weeks ago. He mentioned the San Bernardino case, but he also mentioned another case of a Louisiana woman, 8 months pregnant, murdered. They have no leads for that case except for she's found with her phone, which is locked. They cannot unlock that phone because it has the exact same operating system as the phone in San Bernardino. Now, fine. So this should, maybe we should take it into a different context. I guess a context where what? Nobody cares in that case because it's not terrorism. I care about whether or not that woman's killer is brought to justice, and not just for justice for her family, but also because I believe law enforcement has a protective function moving forward.
Eric, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I would just say it's the debate here is essentially about how do you build and treat technology as a legal policy matter? Do you develop a legal regime where technology has to be designed or accommodated in a certain way for individual attacks or murders or emotionally gripping incidents? And I think that what you're hearing from the privacy and civil liberties community is many of the people on the so-called other side don't understand technology, don't understand how designing technology in a particular way can be a slippery slope. So, you know, Susan's certainly right that this is not just about the San Bernardino attack. There are many other cases where it's very easy to make people feel bad for opposing an order like this. On the other hand, you do have a precedent question. I think I don't necessarily know that the privacy folks are overstating the aspect of precedent when we've seen how it can be used in a situation like this. We know that precedent is an issue. That is an issue in court cases like this. So
Right.
I don't necessarily know that I would play that down, especially when the very high-profile cases are very sympathetic. That is, we have seen that there's documentation to suggest that that is a strategy. And of course, why wouldn't it be your strategy if it was easy to win these sympathetic cases and use that as precedent for the future? So the idea of labeling that a conspiratorial view as, and I'm not saying that Susan has, but certainly you've heard that from some others, I think it's a valid perspective when you look at how the law has been used.
So I do think it's important to note here that this question of whether or not the law applies appropriately here is a question for a federal judge to determine, and it's essentially a factual question, right? Either the law appropriately applies here or it doesn't. Now, if the argument is that in some future case, if this is true here, in some future case the law might also appropriately apply, that's a reason to change the law. And the beautiful part about this country is we are all empowered to change those laws. Now, if the argument is we need to take a serious look at what these laws look like, we need to pass new legislation, I wholeheartedly support that view. I think the problem is that Apple is really kind of threading a needle here, right? They're saying that this is a question for Congress to decide, and yet they essentially oppose all legislative efforts that might result in law enforcement access.
Yeah, I want to get to one point real quick because we're running low on time. The question of consequences from here. We have Stephen who says, I think Apple should be ordered to face prison time for their unwillingness to cooperate with the investigation. No one is above any law, not even Apple, similar to an experience you've had at a previous show that you just mentioned. And we have Mohsen over here who asks, how likely is Apple to succeed in resisting the FBI court order? Julian, just in terms of...
This is a little bit misleading, right? I mean, it's not like they're saying, anarchy, man the barricades, we refuse under any circumstances to comply with the court. They are exercising their right when served with a court order to get a hearing challenging that order and get it suppressed because they think it's legally inappropriate for any number of reasons. That's a right anyone has when they're served with a court order. If they lose, they have a series of appeals, and then if they lose all their appeals, presumably they will comply as best they're able. But it's not like they're doing something defiant or putting themselves above the law. They are participating in the legal process and arguing why they don't think that order is valid.
Right, and on
it's
this
playing
point,
out among the public. The court of public opinion is also making their decisions. We're running out of time, but in a sentence, Eric, what do you think is going to happen? Is Apple going to come out victorious on this?
I'm actually, it's very difficult to predict. The particular judge in this case is a former federal prosecutor, so I don't expect her to change her mind about this order that she has issued. I think it's going to go up the system, probably going to end at the appeals court level, which is the second highest level
All right,
in the United States.
I'm ending you there, Eric. Thank you so much, Eric Geller, Susan Hennessey, and Julian Sanchez. I'm taking them all to the post show. Still so much to talk about. Join us at stream.aljazeera.com. See you there. Welcome to the Streams online post show. We're unpacking the many layers to the Apple FBI debate. We're going to get right back into it. As we were starting the post show, our two guests, Julian and Susan, were looking behind them at the many tweets that are coming in, because everyone has an opinion on this, and so they're streaming in behind you. We want you to keep them coming. Use hashtag AJStream. And speaking of the people who are watching, the people who this actually affects, I want to read you a tweet. This is from Edward Snowden, the former National Security Agency contractor who blew the whistle on spying. Edward Snowden writes, "The FBI is creating a world where citizens rely on Apple to defend their rights rather than the other way around." Susan, what do you make of that?
So look, I think this goes back to a point Julian made, which we're on complete agreement here, and that is that there's nothing unpatriotic about what Apple's doing. They have the right to vindicate their interest in court. That said, they're a huge multinational corporation, and so while their voice is important to this debate, it needs to be understood in its appropriate context. I think that the notion that what Apple is doing speaks for the civil liberties of all Americans, it's a little bit contrary to sort of the democratic process as we understand it, right? Typically, we understand that Americans express their civil liberties values through voting, through creating laws, through electing representatives. And so this notion that a corporation, which, by the way, their massive financial interest just so happens to align with their deeply held commitment to these civil liberties beliefs, I think we need to be suspicious of that. I also think it's important to understand that the FBI is not acting out of a place, or I don't perceive it as acting out of a place of ideological commitment, right? This is their job. Their job is to see what the limits of the law are as they pursue an investigation. Everybody here is playing their roles. We will certainly see, this debate being had robustly. We will see excellent representation in court. That said, this all sort of ultimately renounces to the idea that people have to decide to participate in the democratic process if they think that they think that a law is not being applied the way they want it to.
Well, Susan, you mentioned, here in the U.S., we vote, and that is how we make our voices heard. Eric, I think it's also fair to say that we make our voices heard by the dollar and by what we buy. So is there a sense at all that this could be good or bad for Apple's consumers? Do they see this as Apple standing up for them, or do you think that this could have negative effects?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I was trying to figure out, would we actually see people flocking to other types of phones if Apple eventually loses this case? Because that would suggest to people, well, maybe they could be forced to do something to my phone someday. And the answer is basically, it's very unlikely that Apple is going to lose a lot of customers either way, because their phones are even now, even with this order looming over them, more secure than the leading competitors from companies that make Android phones.
Eric,
Android
you're killing me. I have an Android phone, and that was my question. Going into the show, we're talking about Apple. Should I be worried?
Well, you should be worried about hackers always. I mean, that's just prudent, right?
Good advice.
Somebody can always figure out a way to access something if it's there. We don't know what particular exploits are available for Android, but I think my point is kind of, I don't perceive Apple as getting any huge financial windfall from this, with people flocking to their phones over this issue. This is, as much as it is a fundamental issue when you take it out to the legal extremes, it's very esoteric to the average person unless they are being hacked because there's a backdoor in their phone and they find out about it. In that case, yeah, if I have an Android phone and it's got a backdoor in the code and I get hacked, yeah, I might want to switch to an iPhone. That is I would predict that's going to be a very rare incident. And of course, we're not talking about Android customers. We're talking about people who already have iPhones.
Right.
I just don't see the market changing very much on this.
Yep.
So we asked the same question to our community, and we have Durgesh over here who's dismissive, saying if only consumers were so aware to make choices based on cases such as these. But John, on the other hand, says, keep it up, Apple, and I will trash my Droid. But I just want to get to one more tweet over here that raises an interesting question. We have David who says, I'm a cynic. Apple wants to protect their profits, and the FBI, like all cops, do not care about the people that they exist to protect. Julian, what do you make about this idea that nobody really here in this debate fundamentally cares about privacy? That this is about profits and marketability on one hand and just getting access to whatever they want on the other?
Well, I don't think it's usually that useful to try and read people's mind. Obviously, Apple cares about their profitability and their reputation, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. If they care about it because they think their customers want their privacy protected, and what makes them profit is acting in a way that makes their customers confident their privacy is protected, that's fine. That's sort of what we want markets to be doing. I think the problem we had in the decade after 9/11 is because so much of this was happening in secret, the easiest thing for a company that cared about its profits was to give the government whatever it wanted, because it was always going to be in your corporate interest to not have to fight the federal government, not have to spend money on lawyers, not to antagonize the same entity that is regulating you and buying products from you when your customers are never going to find out how much cooperation you've been giving. The incentives have flipped now, and I think that's frankly healthier. These are companies that have enormous quantities of data about us, enormous access to the devices in our homes, on and sometimes in our bodies and our cars. They really hold the keys to the kingdom in a lot of ways, and you can be happy or unhappy about it, but it's a fact. And if that's the world we live in now, I want those companies to have the incentive to be the ones pushing back, because the people at the ground level who are affected typically aren't going to find out until it's too late to do much about it.
Susan, one of the things that me and Omar saw online, people discussing, is the rights of some of the victims in this. Some of them were iPhone users. Even the suspects' family members said they're okay with, unlocking this phone. What do you think of that argument and their rights?
Right, so I think it's important to sort of understand that there's an immediate case that's happening, and then there's this larger discussion. In the immediate case, there are a lot of difficult equities. So anyone, either Jim Comey or Tim Cook, who tells you that this is an easy case, it's an easy decision, or it's an easy application of the law, is selling you something. That's right, these are all enormously complex issues. Apple certainly should be making a very strong case. They're in many cases in the best position to be able to explain what the burden might look like, something that the law actually incorporates as the consideration. That said, I think it's also important to understand the kind of compelling government interest at play, and I do think it's important to contextualize that lawful government access is not always a bad thing, right? We expect the FBI to do a job. We expect law enforcement to do a particular job. And so I do think it's useful to sort of understand that just as there are citizens that are interested in preserving the technology that they want to access in the future, there are also victims in this case that have rights as well.
And you did say that anyone who says that this is easy would be selling you something, so I do want to show you what FBI Director James Comey said. He said just today, actually, he's quoted saying the Apple versus FBI debate is the hardest question I've seen in government, and this was during a hearing on the Hill here in Washington, D.C. I do want to give the last word to you, Eric, because we just heard from Julian and we heard from Susan. What did you want to say to wrap up this conversation?
Well, I would just say, I think one of the most important questions you can consider is, where does this go after this case? And I've said it many times already, so I sound like a broken record, but precedent does matter. I mean, until Congress writes a law that defines the exact limits of the FBI's power in cases like this, all we're going to have is judges considering previous cases that have already been disposed of and deciding, well, okay, the FBI wants this. A judge gave it the power to demand this. How similar are those two things? And that is going to be, I would say, the defining legal and judicial challenge of the next few years. I'm frankly very pessimistic that Congress will do anything soon. So it is going to be in the court of judges for a very long time, I think, and we'll just have to see how they interpret previous orders and what that changes about what the government can do.
And since the majority of us are phone holders, whether they're iPhone, Android, BlackBerry, what say you, everyone will be watching, I can safely assume. Do you want the last word to go to community? Are they saying something? They're telling you something?
I can give you a couple of competing thoughts here from community to close with. Rajat says consumers see that Apple is fighting an important battle on their behalf. On the other hand, Anu says nothing really of interest here. It's just a publicity stunt.
to be seen. I want to thank all of our guests. Thanks to Julian Sanchez, Susan Hennessey, and Eric Geller for this fascinating conversation, and for joining us today. Thank you as well.